It's the high mark of the Christian calendar. Some would argue maybe that Christmas is, but really Christmas is the precursor. It's the prelude to this. And this celebration comes in two movements, if you will. There's Good Friday today, and there's Easter Sunday. But this is the heavier one. This is the one that feels a bit like a funeral. And it ought to. It ought to feel weighty. The other day, one of my kids said to me, why do they call it Good Friday? And the other ones popped up and went, yeah, why do they call it Good Friday? I was about to answer them because it's easy, right? And I was like, actually, it's actually not that easy. Why do we call it Good Friday? What's the sadistic fascination that we as Christians have with an innocent man without sin or an innocent deity hanging on a cross, the most brutal of torture devices, and we would call that Good Friday? One could easily argue that is quite the opposite. And yet I would hold fast and say, no, indeed, it is Good Friday. But it's Good Friday because it was the day that man was redeemed to his Creator. It's not about a man hanging on the cross. It's actually the story of the redemption of evil. It's the evil that on March 27th of this year allowed a shooter to go into a school and brutally kill 6 people. 3 of them were kids. It's the evil that puts fentanyl-laced drugs on our streets in Kamloops, where last year we had a record death rate here in Kamloops because of fentanyl. It's the evil that has the hatred and the jealousy, the lust and the pride. It's the evil that lives in you, and it's evil that lives in me, and it's the evil that gets defeated by this cross. I present to you Good Friday. In a few minutes, we're going to celebrate communion in a little bit. But before we get there, I want to unpack really what this is. So feel free to go to Luke 23:44, open your Bibles up. But I want to take a few moments just as a precursor to what this is. You see, this communion table is actually part of a larger meta-narrative. It's part of a story arc that talks about the faithfulness of God and the freedom of man. And that larger story arc actually starts in Exodus, culminates at the cross, and we now are part of that story looking back, realizing that it always has been life for a life. It's always been life for a life. As Israel is under bondage in Egypt for 430 years, they cry out for freedom from slavery. And God says to Moses, I have heard their cry. There's a parental love that comes. I've heard their cry. I ache. Hosea even says, Israel, how can I give you up? How can I give you up? This is my child. And so at this point, Israel has done nothing to earn this. It is simply God's faithfulness. It is God enacting a plan to redeem man to himself. And as the narrative goes in Exodus, God places judgment on Egypt, and he systematically undermines each of the Egyptian deities one at a time, till finally he gets to the final deity. And it's the death of the firstborn, that's the judgment being laid out. And it says that Pharaoh hardened his heart to the sovereignty of God. He says, who is this God you speak of? Eerily similar to what the serpent said to Eve, isn't it? Did God really say? Thomas Sowell, he's an economist and a political thinker. He has this to say: the most basic question is not what is best, but who decides what is best. The basic question is not what is best, but who is it that decides what is best? And so in this case, Pharaoh hardened his heart because he would know best, and God places judgment on Egypt. I don't know if you've ever been around kids. at all, ever. But when they get together, there's somehow some level of chaos that always ensues. And especially if they get in their own world, they do their own thing. And if you try and reach out or call out to me, you call out and they look at you, and then they get back distracted again. And then you call them out again, they look at you and so you play this game till finally you go, look at me, look at me. Do you see me? Sometimes you actually have to turn their head and go, look at me, look at me. Well, what's happening at that moment? You see, they're being wrapped into the chaos, and you are an outside, trustworthy, credible, calm presence that's actually pulling from the chaos and saying, look at me, I need you to look at me. Right? We've seen movies where someone's drowning or there's a natural catastrophe. And in that, there's someone's panicking, and the person on the outside is able to help them. But what does he say? He says, look at me, look, don't worry about the chaos. I can help you, but you need to trust me. You need to look at me. Look at me in the eye. That's right, look at me in the eye, you'll be okay. As God passes judgment on Egypt, this is what happens. Israel, look at me. I've heard your cry. I've heard your cry. And I love you. And you matter to me. I need you to trust me. What I need you to do is I need you to sacrifice a lamb. And then I want you to put that blood on the doorpost. And as my judgment comes, you will be covered by the blood of the lamb, and you will not come under my judgment. Listen, listen, trust me. Just trust me. Look at me, trust me. I'll be okay, trust me. I'm here, you matter. Israel's now forced to make a decision. And indeed, God's judgment does come. And the firstborn male dies all the way from Pharaoh all the way down. But where the blood was, where the blood of the lamb was over the doorpost, there God's judgment passed by. Because he is faithful. And he has always been faithful. And that is the God that we celebrate now. And so as we think about that, and he says to you, Dave, look at me. Look at me. Sally, look at me. Look at me. What are the things that you're trying to get your eyes back away from? Is it the bank account, or is it the Instagram feed, or is it what the neighbor has? What is you're taking your gaze away from Jesus? Because he's looking at you saying, Steve, look at me. Look at me, Steve. Look at me. This was a monumental moment for Israel. So much so that God says to Israel, remember. Remember. Remember how? By celebrating Passover. You see, in our Western thinking, when we say remember, it's more of a conceptual thing. It's actually trying to, between your two ears, you're kind of replaying, thinking of grandpa or thinking back in history. But actually what God is saying is, I want you to remember and I want you to partake and act in. You are part of this story. This is not something that happened to your forefathers. This is part of my faithfulness to you, and you are part of that story. Remember, enact, celebrate Passover. Look at me. Remember. We fast forward 1,300 years and we find Jesus at the Last Supper. We're all familiar with the painting of Jesus at the Last Supper. Spoiler alert, it's completely not accurate. But we get this idea of Jesus at the Last Supper, and Jesus is celebrating Passover. For 1,300 years, Israel has been faithful to celebrate Passover, to remember, and Jesus is celebrating it right now. And it's a bit of an irony because none of the disciples really know what's going on. They don't really quite get what's about to happen, not like John the Baptist. You see, he opens up and says, behold, the Lamb of God, who what? Takes away the sin of the world. What John had already figured out was that the blood of the Lamb that was sacrificed at Passover, Jesus was now the culmination of that. That Jesus himself becomes the spotless Lamb. That the Old Testament sacrifices were mere shadows of the substance that was Christ. And that the death of Christ would now be the culmination. It would be the crescendo. It would be the overture. It would be the moment of time where this would all come together. as the Passover lamb as the Passover lamb caused the destroyer to pass over the houses in Israel or in Egypt, now Christ's blood causes God's judgment to pass over sinners. Where the first Passover marked the Hebrews' release from Egypt, it is now Christ's death, get this, Christ's death that marks the release of our slavery to sin. The story has never changed. Bonhoeffer has a quote that says this: God lets himself be pushed out of this world and onto a cross so that he can become the atoning lamb. And the irony is as Jesus hangs on the cross, not mere kilometers away, down the street, if you will, at the same time as Jesus is dying, guess what's happening at the temple? The Passover lamb is being sacrificed. This is where the story crescendos. This is it. And so we pick up with Luke. In Luke 44. And Luke is going to walk us through three different phases. The darkness over the land, the second proclamation of it is finished, and finally, it is our response. So Luke 23:44. And now it was about the 6th hour, and darkness fell over the whole land until the 9th hour, because the sun was obscured. Creation responds. There's a supernatural darkness foretold in Amos and Exodus that there would be. There's a darkness here. Even Matthew unpacks it and says there's an earthquake and the rocks split. We are inching away to the death of Jesus. We're moments away from his death. And what happens? The earth groans in agony. The earth has to respond. It's convulsing. It has to respond to the crucifixion of the Creator on the cross. The magnitude, the severity cannot be overlooked, and even creation acknowledges this. Many thinkers have wrestled through this. Dale Bruner is one of them, and he has this to say: dark clouds and a deep gloom are across the faces of the earth. To say meteorologically, naturally, physically, and in sign language, this is it. As the beginning, Jesus was singled out with the baptism of the opening of the heavens and the descending of the dove and the divine voice. Now at the end, he is being singled out again, but this time cosmically. As if to say to the whole world, the most significant thing that has ever happened is happening right now. And at the very time of the day when the sun is supposed to be at its zenith, everything slipped. You hear that? Creation slipped. Luke carries on. And the veil of the temple was torn in two, and Jesus cried out in a loud voice, saying, Father, in your hands I commit my spirit. And having said this, he breathed his last. Matthew adds in, it is finished. What is finished? What is actually finished? The great longing for direct access, that is finished, is now completed, is here. You see, God resided in the Holy of Holies. It was 4 layers in from the rest of civilization. In other words, you couldn't get there. That is where the Holy of Holies was. He resided there. And once a year, we would send a high priest in for us. And he would go and he would make a sacrifice, and we would hope that he has washed himself clean, because if he didn't, we'd have to pull him out with a rope. Why? Because the holiness of God cannot have unholiness, and we are unholy. We cannot be in the presence of God because he is holy. We cannot see his face. We cannot touch the ark. Why? Because he is holy and we are not. And so as Jesus, inching into his death, finally dies and says, it is finished, and in your hands I commit my spirit, the very curtain that God put in place to separate him from creation, the very curtain that actually put distance between us and our Creator, he grabs the top of it and he tears it in two. Because he does not reside there anymore, he now resides in his people. And where before we could not get to, he now opens up and says, I am here. Hebrews 6:19. Jesus becomes the high priest going behind the curtain. Hebrews 10:19, we enter the sanctuary with confidence in the blood of Jesus. We are now under the high priest, and we have access. The very thing that we had in Eden has been restored, and we now walk and talk with our Creator, and He resides in His people. Luke carries on. Now, when the centurion saw what had happened, he began praising God, saying, "Certainly this man was innocent." And all the crowds who came together for the spectacle, when they observed what had happened, began to return, beating their chest. And all the acquaintances and the women who accompanied him from Galilee were standing at a distance, seeing these things. Certainly this man was innocent, he says. 2019, a student by the name of Robert James was among 400 graduates of the Morehouse University in Atlanta. And they were at the commencement speech during the graduation. They had brought in a fellow by the name of Robert Smith, who was a founder and chairman of an equity firm or something. And they brought him in, and as you can well imagine, for those who've been to commencement speeches, you're not really paying much attention. Sure, you're kind of half listening, but really you're thinking about what you've just accomplished. You're thinking about what you're going to do tonight and maybe tomorrow. You're thinking about what you're doing later on in life. You're thinking about your future. You might be thinking about your debt that you now have, whatever. But your mind is elsewhere. It's probably not wholly engaged in what he is saying, what Mr. Smith is saying. And I watched this movie, and all of a sudden you can hear everyone's focus comes together. Because this is what Mr. Smith says. He says, "Brothers, your debt's been paid. Your student loan has now been paid. You had 400 students there, collectively with $34 million in debt, student loan debt, that was forgiven instantly at that moment." What do you say to that? I mean, you're stunned, you're staggered, you're stupefied. How can you respond to something like that? This was their intelligent response. We looked at each other and said, "Is he serious?" That was the most intelligent response you could. You're at a loss for words. When you have put your name on the bottom of the dotted line and you are responsible for that debt, and now you have to find a way to pay back, I did the quick math, $80,000 in US, which is equivalent to about $1 million Canadian. When you have to, you got it quicker than the last one. Okay. When you have to pay that much back that quickly and you don't know how you're going to do it, and somebody comes in and says, "Yes, you absolutely owe that. But I paid it." The lift that you have, there is no response adequate enough. As we look at the centurion and his encounter with Jesus, when he encounters Jesus, he is absolutely humbled and broken, and he is at a loss for words. What can you say? Truly, this is the Son of God. The picture behind me is by an artist named James Tussaud, 1890. He's a French painter. When I look at that, all I see is a man who's completely undone by the presence of Jesus. Realizing a life for a life. There's a song we sing here often. I'm going to pull a verse out. It says this: "Behold the man upon the cross, my sin on his shoulders. Ashamed I hear my mocking voice calling out among the scoffers. It was my sin that put him there until it was accomplished. It was his dying breath that brought me life. I know it is finished." You see, when you're faced with the cross, you only have two responses. All of us only have two responses. Your heart will harden, or your heart will soften. Either you will hear your mocking voice calling out among the scoffers, or you will say, surely this was the Son of God. Either your heart will harden like Pharaoh's, or it will soften like the mocking crowd that was there the entire day. Matthew tells us the crowd ridiculed Jesus the entire day. And Luke tells us at the end of that day, they went home beating their chest. Your heart will either harden or your heart will soften. This is not a trite issue. That simply your debt has been paid. But it came at the cost. It came at the cost of a life, and that life was the Son of God. And as he hung there, he says, look at me. Look at me. Your debt's been paid. I've paid it. You matter to me. You have purpose. I can give you purpose. I can give you meaning. Don't look up there. Look at me. Look at me. I'm outside that chaos. Look at me. Look at me. There's some of you here and you're journeying through this Christianity thing. My question for you is simply, who's in charge? I go back to the quote. The most basic question is not what is best, but who decides what is best. You know, are you taking direction from the same people that are in the same chaos that you are? How's that working out? What if there's somebody outside of that chaos that says, look at me, look, don't worry about them. Don't worry about them, just trust me. I am trustworthy, I have been faithful, and I will continue to be faithful. Come. Some of you have been journeying with Jesus for a long time. And over time, your gaze starts to slip. And yet, when you look at the cross, we cannot be helped but be broken. And so my question is, when was the last time you were broken at the foot of the cross? When was the last time you were grieved at the foot of the cross? We're going to celebrate communion. And this is an anchoring tradition that we have done for 3,500 years. When Israel left Egypt, culminating at the crucifixion, and now we are part of that story looking back. But we are part of that story. We are part of that redemptive story. And so when you come up, Jesus says, look at me. Look at the bread. Look at the wine. Look.